14 July 2008. Bradford. Two girls in local authority care leave their placement and never make it back in the same condition. The abuse begins that night will define the next years of their lives and expose a pattern of abuse already known across the region but still happening in plain sight. Whereas in 2011 in Sheffield, a teenager reports serious harm to the authorities. The information is logged, then nothing happens, no investigation, no safeguarding. And in the silence that follows, the people targeting her continue without interruption. Then, years later, the patterns still continue, and on the 2nd of June 2021, a homeless woman, unable to get into the shelter for the night, is approached by a man who offers her somewhere to warm up, a decision that will lead to consequences she could never have anticipated. This is the story of how grooming gangs and organized groups of offenders were able to target these victims, and how, years later, the men behind it were finally brought to justice. Welcome to UK Crime Documentaries. Let's get straight into the case. They were both 14 when they entered the Bradford Metropolitan District Council Children's Home in 2008. For the staff, their arrival wasn't unusual. The home was a non-secure unit, designed to offer supervision and support, but without the legal authority to stop children leaving the building whenever they chose. It meant the young people inside could walk out at any hour, no matter how vulnerable they were. And these two girls were already carrying the kind of instability that makes a child easy to target, like repeated placement moves, fractured family backgrounds, and a pattern of running away that had followed them for years. Within weeks, the risks became obvious. Staff noticed one of the girls was disappearing late at night and returning in the early hours. On several occasions, she was seen getting into cars driven by adult men, but with the restrictions of the unit, there was little more the workers could do than record it and hope she came back safely. These warning signs would later form the starting point of one of Bradford's most serious child exploitation investigations. At that same time, a man named Basharat Khalik began to appear in their lives. He was 27, significantly older than the girls, and already familiar with the routines of vulnerable teenagers in the area. His first contact with them was presented as ordinary, almost unremarkable. He approached them near a petrol station, bought them vodka, and positioned himself as someone who understood them better than the adults responsible for their care. It was a tactic seen repeatedly in grooming cases across the region. Small favors, small risks, and a growing sense of loyalty built long before any abuse is reported. By the end of that year, Khalik had established himself as a consistent presence around the girls, a relationship that would later be shown to have marked the beginning of a pattern of exploitation that continued long after they left the children's home. Once the initial contact was established in 2008, the situation developed into a sustained pattern of exploitation. For one of the girls, Khalik's involvement stretched over 3 years, long enough for his influence to become routine. He used familiar grooming tactics that appear repeatedly in CSE investigations, offering attention, presenting himself as someone who cared, and creating the impression that he was the only person willing to listen. These gestures isolated her from sources of support and made it harder for her to recognize the control he was exercising. Over time, other men were drawn into the arrangement. The girls were taken to different addresses around Bradford, including houses used by various offenders, hotel rooms booked for short periods, and the former home linked to Saeed Akhtar. Each location provided another environment where boundaries were removed and access to the girls was made easy. On top of that, alcohol and drugs played a regular role, lowering their awareness and reducing their ability to resist what was happening. Some of the offenders used threats or intimidation, others relied on the pretense of a relationship, but the result was the same: repeated exploitation by multiple adults. For Fiona, the exploitation extended into tasks beyond the abuse itself. At Akhtar's direction, she was sent out to collect drugs, instructed to meet people she didn't know, and expected to return with whatever he demanded. She had no control over these situations and no ability to refuse. But what happened next would push the case far beyond hidden exploitation and into the eyes of authorities for the first time. But after years of silence, the truth would finally surface. And it began with a single disclosure in an unrelated investigation. For years, the abuse remained undisclosed. The breakthrough came unexpectedly, during a police interview linked to a separate child exploitation investigation. One of the victims, questioned in connection with that case, revealed details of what had happened to her years earlier. That single disclosure became the first step in uncovering the wider pattern involving multiple offenders. Around the same time, in 2014, Fiona saw a BBC report on the large-scale grooming and abuse uncovered in Rotherham. We will cover those cases in another video. The similarities were so clear that she recognized her own experiences in what she was watching. She later said that was the moment she realized her case also belonged in the open. She asked her partner to contact the BBC, who then passed the information directly to the police. Once both disclosures reached investigators, a full inquiry was launched. Detectives began taking detailed statements, tracing past movements, reviewing records from the children's home, and building a historical timeline of events dating back to 2008. Forensic evidence, interviews with witnesses, and the accounts of both victims formed the foundation of what would become a large and complex prosecution. This investigation did not happen in isolation. Across the UK, multiple grooming cases were being uncovered during the same period, in Rochdale, Rotherham, Oxford, Telford, and elsewhere. National attention to child exploitation was increasing rapidly, prompting police forces and safeguarding agencies to re-examine older reports and take new allegations more seriously. The Bradford case emerged within that broader national context, where patterns of exploitation involving groups of men targeting vulnerable girls were finally receiving public and institutional scrutiny. By 2016, detectives had identified the network of offenders involved and prepared charges against 9 men, setting the stage for a lengthy trial. The abuse left both victims with long-term and severe consequences. Fiona, once considered a promising student, predicted A grades, dropped out of school during the period of exploitation. Her education and future plans were completely disrupted. She was later diagnosed with PTSD, depression, and severe anxiety, conditions documented in her victim impact statements. She described persistent nightmares, difficulty sleeping, and a reliance on long-term medication. Fiona also disclosed a history of self-harm and multiple suicide attempts, beginning when she was still a teenager. The second victim experienced similar long-term effects. She reported intense anxiety that made basic tasks extremely difficult. She spoke of being unable to shop, go out for meals, or socialize because of overwhelming fear. Both victims repeatedly described feelings of being worthless, dirty, and used. One of the most significant consequences involved Fiona's role as a mother. Her eldest daughter was placed for forced adoption, not due to deficiencies in her parenting, but because the unsafe lifestyle created by the offenders made it impossible for her to keep the child in her care. She later described this as a direct result of the abuse. Across both victims, the psychological and emotional damage was long-lasting, extensive, and directly connected to the years of exploitation they endured. The case proceeded to a 6-week trial at Bradford Crown Court, where prosecutors presented years of overwhelming evidence. The court heard from both victims, whose statements formed the backbone of the prosecution's case, supported by CCTV footage, forensic findings, and communication patterns that aligned with their accounts. Prosecutor Karma Melli QC outlined how the offenders operated, what we have already covered. Throughout the trial, the defense attempted to distance the men from responsibility. Several defendants claimed they were drunk or using cannabis at the time and therefore could not remember what had happened. Others denied involvement entirely. These explanations were rejected by the jury when weighed against the consistency of the victims' accounts and the supporting evidence. Judge Jonathan Durham Hall, QC, described the behavior exposed during the trial as clear, determined, and insidious grooming, and referred repeatedly to the appalling catalogue of abuse the girls had endured. He emphasized that the actions of the group had caused profound and lasting damage, and highlighted that cases like this reflected patterns seen repeatedly across the UK. The court also heard references to other unidentified men involved at various stages. While not all could be charged due to insufficient evidence or inability to trace them, their presence further illustrated the broader network of individuals who gained access to the victims over the years. Jury found 9 men guilty of a total of 22 offences, bringing the full scale of the exploitation into public view. But the trial was only part of the story, because before sentencing, 2 of the convicted offenders attempted an astonishing act inside the courthouse itself. Two of the defendants, Naveed Akhtar and Fahim Iqbal, attempted to smuggle prohibited items into HMP Leeds while the proceedings were still ongoing. Akhtar, who was on bail at the time, asked to use the toilet behind the dock. He remained inside long enough to raise suspicion. Moments later, Iqbal, already a serving prisoner transported to court daily, requested to use the same toilet. Before he could enter, a custody officer checked the cubicle and found a concealed package inside the toilet roll dispenser. The contents were extensive: 2 miniature mobile phones, charging cables, 10 SIM cards, Subutex tablets, and around 25 grams of tobacco. When the judge halted the trial so the area could be searched further, police discovered a second package under a chair in the dock containing cannabis resin, skunk cannabis, another miniature phone, and additional Subutex tablets. The attempted smuggling forced a temporary suspension of the trial while officers carried out a full investigation within the court building. Both men later admitted conspiring to supply controlled substances and conspiring to convey mobile phones into a prison. Judge Jonathan Durham Hall, QC, condemned the plot as remarkable stupidity, noting that the plan had been carried out under the noses of court staff and was doomed to failure from the outset. For their actions, Akhtar and Iqbal each received an additional 5 months on top of their original sentences for the grooming offences. And with the courtroom disruption resolved, only the final outcome remained: the sentences that would determine the future of every man involved. Basharat Khalik received 20 years. Saeed Akhtar was also jailed for 20 years. His brother, Naveed Akhtar, was sentenced to 17 years for 2 counts of rape. Parvazi Ahmed, convicted of 3 rapes, received 17 years. And Mohammed Usman, found guilty of 2 rapes, was jailed for 17 years as well. Kieran Harris, responsible for 2 rapes, received 17 years, while Isa Hussain was jailed for 16 years. Fahim Iqbal, convicted of aiding and abetting one of Harris's rapes, received 7 years. The final defendant, Sishan Ali, convicted of assault, was sentenced to 18 months. In total, the group received over 132 years in prison, with some reports placing the combined figure above 140 depending on how the additional sentences are calculated. But Bradford was only one part of a wider pattern, because in another town, another group of offenders was shaping a different network, hidden behind ordinary streets and familiar routines. Her story began long before Sheffield. Years before any offender entered her life, she had already been navigating instability that most teenagers never face. Growing up in East Yorkshire, her childhood was marked by constant disruption, a pattern of social services involvement, unsettled living arrangements, and a home life that never gave her a chance to feel anchored. The loss of her mother at just 13 years old left her with no stable support system, widening the gap between her and any sense of safety. By her early teens, she had become known to multiple agencies, moving between temporary placements as professionals tried to manage a situation that was already slipping out of control. Her transfer to a Sheffield care home sometime between 2010 and 2012 was intended to provide structure, a new start in a different city, away from the instability that had defined her early teenage years. But the move also meant being separated from familiar faces at the very moment she was least able to cope with another upheaval. It was inside this environment, exhausted, isolated, and desperate for even a fragment of connection, that she became exactly the kind of target certain men seek out. And it didn't take long before those men appeared, watching, approaching, and identifying her vulnerabilities long before she knew the danger she was walking into. When the victim arrived in Sheffield, the first person she encountered was Amanda Spencer, someone already known to the courts for taking advantage of young people who were unstable or unsupported. Her previous history showed a clear pattern, identifying teenagers who were isolated or emotionally vulnerable and drawing them into harmful situations involving adults who should never have been near them. By the time she met this victim, Spencer understood exactly how to gain the trust of someone who felt abandoned and out of place. Spencer presented herself as a friend at a moment when the girl had very few. What seemed like ordinary companionship quickly shifted into influence and control. Spencer began directing her towards a group of adult men, individuals far older who showed interest only after Spencer made the introductions. These encounters were not accidental. They were deliberate steps that placed the victim into situations she was too young and too isolated to recognize as unsafe. Her involvement went beyond simply introducing people. Spencer arranged where the girl would go, who she would meet, and the circumstances in which each meeting would take place. Like the previous and all the related cases, the victim was repeatedly supplied with alcohol, cannabis, methadone, and cocaine, substances that reduced her awareness and made it harder for her to protect herself. These were not offered casually. They were tools of control given to her in circumstances where refusal felt impossible. The prosecution later described how the men took advantage of her condition, creating situations where she was too intoxicated to understand what was happening or too frightened to resist. When substances alone did not keep her compliant, intimidation filled the gap. Threats, aggressive behavior, and the constant suggestion that there would be consequences if she tried to leave or speak up became part of the routine. She learned to keep quiet, to stay close to the people who frightened her because she had no safe alternative. The men treated her like an object, a phrase used to capture the complete absence of care shown towards a child who should have been protected. Under these conditions, she was taken to flats and houses across Sheffield, where she was repeatedly raped while under the influence of substances she had been encouraged or pressured to take. Whenever they wanted her, they contacted her, and the same pattern repeated itself again and again. The victim later described feeling moved from place to place without understanding how she had reached that point, or how she was meant to stop it. And when she finally tried to report what was happening, the response she received would shape the years that followed. In 2011, at a time when the victim was still a child and still under the care of the authorities, she reached a point where she attempted to seek help. She reported to South Yorkshire Police that she was being exploited by a group of older men. She described the abuse, the location she was being taken to, and the people who were controlling her movements. What happened next became one of the most significant missed opportunities in the entire case. Officers recorded elements of what she said as intelligence, but no formal crime report was opened. No investigation was launched. And above all, no safeguarding steps were taken to remove her from the men who were exploiting her, or even to examine the addresses she had identified. The lack of action allowed the situation around her to carry on exactly as it had before. The men who had access to her continued to do so for years, with no intervention that might have broken the hold they had built around her. It would take several more years and multiple disclosures before authorities fully recognized what had been happening. By then, the damage was deep, the impact long-lasting, and the number of men involved far greater than anyone had realized back in 2011. But eventually, the silence around her began to break. And when the truth finally surfaced, it exposed a wider pattern far beyond a single child or a single city. It was around 2016 when the victim made contact with police again, years after her first disclosure had been overlooked. This time, her account triggered a comprehensive reinvestigation. Officers began working through everything that had once been dismissed. What followed was a detailed reconstruction of her movements, the people around her, and the pattern of exploitation that had continued unchecked for years. Investigators gathered statements, cross-referenced records, and sought corroboration wherever they could find it. Slowly, a wider network emerged, the same men appearing repeatedly in her history, the same locations described in different contexts, and a clear timeline showing how deeply she had been drawn into their world. As the evidence was assembled, several suspects were charged. Some would later be acquitted when the jury could not be sure, but a number of key defendants were brought before the court. Among them were Jassim Mohammed, Kawan Omar Ahmed, Nzar Anwar, and Shangar Ibrahimi, each accused of playing a role in the exploitation that had started when the victim was still in her early teens. Another individual, Saba Mohammed, faced charges for perverting the course of justice after attempting to interfere with the investigation. The trial required the victim to give evidence over several days, revisiting years of trauma under intense scrutiny. Her testimony became central to the case, supported by the corroborative material police had recovered throughout the reinvestigation. Prosecutors described the whole details that we have already covered. When the prosecution closed its case, it was the first time the actions of the defendants, the missed opportunities of 2011, and the depth of her exploitation had been examined side by side. And as the jury prepared to deliver its decisions, the outcome would determine whether years of silence would finally be answered with accountability. Police acknowledged openly that the victim had shown exceptional courage in coming forward a second time, especially after her first attempt to seek help in 2011 had not been acted upon. Senior officers described her testimony as crucial. South Yorkshire Police formally recognised earlier failings, stating that opportunities to intervene had been missed and that steps should have been taken sooner to safeguard her. Those acknowledgements became part of the wider discussion around the case, a reminder of how essential early action is when a vulnerable child reports exploitation. When the verdicts were delivered, the judge addressed each defendant in turn, setting out the roles they had played and the long-term harm their actions had caused. Jassim Mohammed received the longest term, 25 years, reflecting both the seriousness of the offences and the period over which the victim had been exploited. Kawan Omar Ahmed was sentenced to 18 years, while Nzar Anwar received 15 years for rape and for his involvement in a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice. Shangar Ibrahimi was jailed for 12 years, and Saba Mohammed was sentenced to 4 years for perverting the course of justice. And while Sheffield's case showed how long-term exploitation can remain hidden in plain sight, another crime, in a different town, years later, revealed a different kind of danger, one that unfolded in a single night. It was late on a June night in 2021 when a 44-year-old woman found herself outside a homeless shelter in Lee, unable to get inside after missing the curfew. She had nowhere else to go. The street was quiet, the temperature was dropping, and she was left alone with no immediate place of safety. The situation made her vulnerable in ways that would become crucial to what happened next. While she remained outside the building, Adrian Wojciech, a man she did not know, approached her. He did so more than once, repeatedly offering what sounded like simple help, the promise of a warm drink, maybe some food, and a place to sit for a short time. Moments earlier, 2 other men, Sandor Kampacu and Konstantin Dumitru, had been seen entering a nearby property on the opposite side of the road. Wojciech stayed behind and continued urging her to join him. With the shelter closed to her and nowhere else to turn, she eventually agreed to follow him across the street. She expected he would take her towards a takeaway or somewhere similar, where she could at least warm up for a moment. Instead, Voicu led her through the door of a flat, locking it behind them. The setting changed instantly, from an offer of help on the street to being inside a property she had not expected to enter. Voicu then instructed her to go upstairs to the top floor flat. With the exit now secured and no safe alternative available, she followed him into the upper room. Inside were Sandokan Paciu and Constantin Dumitru, and another man who has never been identified or located was also present. After this, she realized she had been brought there under false pretenses and was now in an environment she had no control over. Over the next 10 to 11 hours, the men subjected her to ongoing abuse while she remained trapped inside the flat, unable to seek help or leave. A fourth, unidentified man was also involved but has never been traced. Eventually, after hours of being held inside the property, the victim managed to leave. As soon as she was able to reach a place of safety, she reported the incident to police. Her account triggered an immediate response, and within 48 hours, officers had arrested all three named offenders, as Adrian Voicu, Sandokan Paciu, and Constantin Dumitru. During their police interviews, each man attempted to distance himself from responsibility. Voicu and Dumitru claimed they had been drunk or under the influence of drugs and could not remember what had taken place. But leaving the flat did not end the ordeal. It was only the beginning of the impact that would follow. The psychological impact was central to the case. Prosecutors outlined how the woman experienced terror throughout the night. What remained was the final step, the sentencing that would determine how long each man would spend in prison for the events of that night. When the case reached Bolton Crown Court, the jury was presented with a clear sequence of evidence. Forensic findings from inside the flat, CCTV showing the men entering the property shortly before the victim was brought inside, and the detailed testimony she gave about the events of that night. Her account was supported by the physical evidence and by the consistency of the timeline established during the investigation. Paciu, when questioned about the victim's distress, responded with indifference, a reaction noted in court as showing a complete lack of concern for her welfare. Their explanations were rejected by the jury when weighed against the evidence. The jury found Adrian Voicu, Sandokan Paciu, and Constantin Dumitru guilty of 2 counts of rape and 1 count of false imprisonment. The verdicts confirmed that all 3 men had acted in coordination and had knowingly held the woman inside the flat for more than 10 hours. At sentencing, the judge described the behavior as predatory, noting that the men had deliberately targeted someone who was vulnerable and alone. Voicu was considered the lead offender and received 13 years. Paciu and Dumitru were each sentenced to 11 years and 6 months. What do you think about the cases and the sentences? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your take. And if you found this breakdown informative, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next episode of UK Crime Documentaries.